Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm going to talk about that really exciting subject of structuralism, subjectivity in reader, reader bias, authorial bias, and the importance of context. And I know this all sounds incredibly dry, but I want to talk about the ones that walk away from Omelas, which was a 1973 story by Ursula K. Guin, and the ones that stay and fight, which I think was 2020, and it's N.K.Jemisin. Now, before I start on this, and I cannot stress this enough, I'm going to look at underpinning structural aspects of the stories that get to essential abstract notions. But, and this is a very important but, the context in which they were written, the detail about what they are discussing and why, the intention of the author, all of these are incredibly important in understanding the actual narrative. And this is the danger of applying something like a structuralist reading to something and taking an absolute sort of abstract position on something versus what is actually going on and in the individual narrative. Now, as an aside to illustrate this, when Campbell wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Campbell took a whole load of folklore and folk tales and stripped away all of their individuality, everything that made them unique, everything that made them the story, the narrative, the essence of them, and was looking for patterns, was trying to find the bones behind everything else. And by analogy, if you look at a whole lot of human skeletons, you will see that they are all roughly the same, that lots of points of comparison you can make. But it is through the individuality of the surface, what we all look like, all of those things added to it, our own brains, how we interact with the world, how we grew up, those things make us people. So if we try to reduce down all of humanity just to the bones of the argument, then we lose sight of what makes humanity humanity. Now, it is still useful to understand the bones, but not at the exclusion of ignoring context, authorial intent, reader bias, reader preoccupations with things, the context in which something is written and why it was written. Those things are incredibly important for the story. So, all that being said, when we think of the ones that walk away from Omelas, the spoilers for both those stories, by the way, I think they're both available to read online for free. I'll try and find links so that people can read them. But in Omelas, Le Guin posits a thought experiment. What if there was a perfect society? And she doesn't try to detail the perfect society, because a utopian ideal is by its very nature unattainable. Hence, good and no being a pun at the start of utopia. And every person, every culture has a different idea of what is going to be perfect. So Le Guin posits an idea, a thought experiment. What if there was a perfect society where almost everyone in that society was happy, cared for, had everything they ever needed, everything was absolutely wonderful, but the cost of that society was borne by one single person. In this case, a child. And it is a devastating look at how much is society willing to pay for what is around us. Structural inequality. The idea that the majority can have a perfect life at the expense of a minority. And is that right? we're all familiar with the sort of utilitarian principle espoused actually on Star Trek of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And when we think in terms of logic, oh, if this society is 10 million people and only one person needs to suffer so that 10 million people can live in paradise, we think of that calculation and go, well, logically, that seems sound. And Le Guin, in her thought experiment, posits this society and asks the question, is that right? And in her story, she talks about those people who, when they realize, because they knowingly inflict suffering on this one child, they knowingly torture this child. And it seems so repugnant, so horrendous, so horrific that we, as the society, the perfect society that's being depicted here, would do this to an innocent, to a perfect innocent, knowingly and willingly do this. But the calculation it comes back to is still the same. The entire society is absolutely perfect at the expense of one. And Le Guin then suggests people who, as individuals, go, no, I cannot countenance this. I cannot, with good conscience, participate in a society that thrives on the suffering of another. And so they walk away. Hence the title, They Walk Away From, those that walk away from Omelas. So much of this is framed as a question. It is framed in a way to ask us, is this principle of a minority suffering so that the majority can thrive? Essentially, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Is that acceptable? Which leads to the logical extension of that. Well, okay, if it's not one, what if it's 10? What if it's 100? What if it's 1,000? And how many need to benefit? Instead of 10 million, what if it's only 1 million? Is it always that as long as there is one more person who benefits than suffers, that it is right? It's asking us to actually consider the implications of that. And then it comes to, so that's one major question that Le Guin is actually posing to us. And again, this is not about, oh, it's going to be great to torture a kid and that is going to result in a utopia. That is the most extreme example I think Le Guin was trying to come up with to illustrate this to us, because this is about structural inequality. This is about a society that is structured in such a way that by taking advantage of a minority, in this case, one child, but in an abstract term, a minority, that the majority thrive at the expense of a minority. And we can see how as soon as we put it in the abstract, we get a lot of what Le Guin is talking about, because it's not just about the specifics. There is an abstract notion that's being explored. And the fact that Le Guin says that there are people within that society who decide to walk away because they cannot countenance, they leave, rather than be part of that society, they leave that society because they will not condone what the society is doing. And Le Guin asks us the question. She asks us to explore this. She asks us to think through the ramifications of this. So, setting Omelas aside for the time being, let's talk about N.K.Jemisin's follow-up to this, a sort of rebuttal of what Le Guin was talking about in her excellent story, which is Those That Stay and Fight. And in this, we find, again, another absolutely perfect, wonderful utopian society. And in this society, if someone and in this society, no one can be sexist or racist or misogynist. No one can inflict these individual prejudices on anyone else. That the society is wonderful and balanced and everyone gets along, everyone works together, everyone serves the greater good of what we're all doing. And because of that, we lift each other up. Because everyone works together, we lift everyone up. And it's this, again, quite nebulous concept of what a perfect society is, because individually we'll all imagine different things about a perfect society. But the cost in this case is this society exists in a realm where, yes, there are parallel universes where different thoughts, different ideas come through. And if someone becomes infected by those thoughts, if they decide that an individual is worth more than the society, and she's not talking about communism before someone goes off on that, it's the idea of everyone banding together as a society, as a community. But if someone starts putting their own needs above those of everyone else, that cannot be countenanced by society. And so they are killed. And that's the cost of this society. And we go, well, if someone is insisting that they deserve more, that they are better, that they are allowed to abuse other people, I think these are the very things that we make laws against and we punish people in our society for. And so they are punished, they are executed. And from a structural point of view, the needs of the majority, the needs of the many, outweigh the needs of the individual, because the majority is better served living in a cooperative society. And anyone who's insisting on individual rights at the expense of someone else's is not necessary for that. And so they are executed. Now, you can see the purpose of, or part of the purpose, I shouldn't say the purpose, part of the purpose of Jemisin's story is, instead of walking away, some of us need to take up the mantle to fight for what is right, to, instead of walking away from Omelas, instead of walking away from structural inequality, that we stand up against it, that we sacrifice part of our lives, our individuality, our comfort, to fight for a better society. So where Le Guin was asking this question and some of the people didn't agree with what was going on in society, so they walked away from the society, Jemisin is saying, no, we need to stay and fight for society. We need to fight for what is right. We need to work towards a greater future, even if that means personal sacrifice. So it is a very powerful message, particularly in the context of civil rights, in the context of gay rights, in the context of protecting minorities from oppression and correcting that majority taking advantage of, through structural inequality, taking advantage of a minority, giving everyone the right to be raised up. And that requires sacrifice. So both authors are looking at it in terms of sacrifices have to be made. What is the sacrifice that we're comfortable with? Now, the reason I want to bring up structuralism and the reason I want to sort of pare things back is because, to my mind, when we ignore the context of the idea of civil rights or gay rights, or the idea of fighting for what is good in society, which is so central to what Jemisin is talking about, if we strip that back and we look solely at what is being argued in the abstract, we have a society in which the majority has decided what is good. The majority has decided this is what we are going to do. And a minority anytime they pop up, who think a different way, the state murders them. And you go, well, oh, hang on, that's not what Jemisin meant. You go, no, it's not what Jemisin meant. It's not what Jemisin intended. And I'm not trying to say in any way that that is what Jemisin intended. But when we strip back the abstract layers, or the content layers, and we think about it in the abstract, we have this society. And if we take away the word perfect, so it's not a perfect society, we have a society that is enforcing its values by, if you are influenced by any alien thought, any alien ideology, anything that deviates from what society has decided is good, we will send in people to murder you. So society kills off anyone who does not agree with it. In Le Guin's question, because this isn't posed as a question by Jemisin. Jemisin poses it very much as, we need to fight for equal treatment for all, which is a very noble goal. But Le Guin posed it as a question. Le Guin posed it as, what is the right thing? Does the individual have the right to dictate to the majority, this is how you should run your world? And if you believe the individual does not have the right to dictate to the majority as a principle, then that individual should walk away. That's one question that Le Guin is raising. How do we feel about bucking the trend of what the majority think? Whereas Jemisin is very much saying, yes, we should stop the bad actors in our society. The problem is, while we are very sympathetic with the society that Jemisin is talking about, where everyone is equal, everyone has been raised up, the principle at work here is the majority has decided what is good, and if an individual or the minority decides that's not right, we want something different, then the majority has a right to execute them. And if we apply that logic to a society in which perhaps their ideals do not align with ours, in which their ideals are antithetical to ours, but they are the majority, are we suggesting that then the majority has a right to kill people who object? The context of Jemisin's story is very much about the importance to fight for the rights of everyone. And that cannot be overstated. But the underlying principle is actually the principle that's rejected in Omelas. Because Omelas, Le Guin's Omelas, says, here's this perfect society, but it's at the cost of the suffering of a minority. And it is presented as, while it's a moral quandary, Le Guin certainly comes down on the fact that we should not be persecuting a minority, that we should not be doing this, and that it is wrong. Jemisin, because of the framing of it for a very positive goal, actually comes down on an argument that suggests, yes, the majority should punish those who don't think the right way. That the state should just execute people who don't agree with them. And you can see how boiling away the context has actually radically altered Jemisin's intention. That this is not what Jemisin intended people to pick up from her story. There is no way that N.K.Jemisin intended people to look at her story and see it as, yes, we should have an authoritarian fascistic state that executes people who don't think the right way, according to how the state should think that they should think. That is counter to the narrative that Jemisin created. But when we strip away the context of what the state is representing here, the ideals that the state is representing, we get to this sort of structural, abstract notion about power dynamics. And the power dynamics in Jemisin's story are the majority decides what is good. And if you as an individual do not agree with that, the majority and the state will execute you. And this is a good thing because it is right to fight for the majority. So this, I wanted to talk about this because this is the danger of taking absolute positions or stripping away context. I think it is very revealing to apply these sorts of techniques to narrative. This is what, when we talk about underlying politics, when we talk about ideology, when we talk about subtext running through something, when we talk about these things, it's very difficult for people to understand why something that they go, but that's not what this is about, why someone else is seeing this. And this is why it's useful. You can see other things in a text that were clearly not intended by the author. This is not the direction that Jemisin intended her story to be read in. And the danger of doing this without awareness of what the author intended, without awareness of the context, without awareness of why Jemisin was writing this, you end up with a reading of Jemisin's work, which is counter to what the narrative should be, that is antithetical to what Jemisin is talking about, but can make a lot of sense and be very, very persuasive. And then if that argument is presented without any of the other things, you can see it's a distortion of Jemisin's writing. But the usefulness of it is, it goes beyond the things that we inherently agree with. I think the vast majority of people would go, oh, the world that Jemisin posits, that is something worth fighting for, where we have all lifted each other up, where we are all respected. Like, who wouldn't want to live in a world that is a paradise for everyone? And you go, that is something worth fighting for. It is something worth striving for. That's part of it. And in order to get there, we have to guard against poisonous and venomous opinions. We have to guard ourselves and protect ourselves from people arguing in bad faith, from people trying to manipulate us, from people trying to strip away the context of what is happening to show us an argument, to go, you see, they're just doing that thing, and trying to bamboozle us. We need to fight against that. That is something we need to be aware of. But someone could very easily use the sort of techniques that I've just talked through to present Jemisin's story as an argument for authoritarian fascistic state control, that, you know, if you don't have right think, that's what the liberals are going to do to you. And that's clearly not what she's doing. So the advantage is it lets these sorts of techniques let you see deeper into a text. It lets you play with and analyze different movements outside of context. But, and I've said this before when I've talked about this subject, context is incredibly important. And so Jemisin's story, analyzing it from a structural perspective, stripping away the rationale for it, her intention, the content that's there, and looking at the bare bones is very revealing. And it's very revealing about the things that we agree with and don't necessarily question, because we look at her story and we don't question it. It is something worth fighting for. But when we look at the underlying principles, we go, is that so different from Omelas, where the cost is the minority? Has Jemisin just argued for a better majority being in charge and a different minority being penalized. And are we okay with that? Why are we okay with it when it aligns with our principles, but we're not okay with it when, well, actually, structurally, it seems a little off? And that's why authors who write these stories present wonderful arguments and concepts for us to think about. Literature is a way of exploring incredibly difficult topics and seeing things from a different perspective. The power of stripping stuff away is to look at it in a different light. And for the sake of argument with Jemisin's work, place a different core moral value at the center of that society. Someone who maybe you ideologically don't agree with. And they say, oh, but we are going to place the individual rights have to be thing. And anyone who tries to organize a group think, the state should just kill them. And we go, oh, we would find that abhorrent. So why are we agreeing with it when it aligns with our beliefs? Why do we agree with the same type of action? Just because we happen to agree with the outcome. When we thought that the utilitarian principle, i.e. the outcome outweighs the negative aspect in Omelas, was bad. But in Jemisin's work, it's good. So it is a balance between these positions. Don't just wholesale believe everything the narrative tells you, because it's narrative. It's meant to be persuading you and telling you something in one direction. The counter narrative reveals facets of it. And structuralism helps you pair out those aspects of counter narrative. So the danger is using the bare bones counter narrative without any consideration of context. Not paying attention to the bare bones structure leads to a surface reading of a text that doesn't actually deal with some of the deeper questions. It is about trying to find a balance point between these things. And so this is one of the reasons why I like these various different sort of, you would almost call structural approaches or narratological approaches. It's also why you can understand, going back to Campbell, why folklorists despise Campbell. The idea of the framework that he created, the hero with a thousand faces, the hero's journey, dismisses the individuality, the context, and the content of all of those stories and presents just the bare bones. That does not take account of the richness of what the individual tales are. However, a wholesale rejection of what Campbell did discounts the various patterns that we can see, structural aspects that we can see, which can be revealing and can encourage us into further thought. So that is what I wanted to talk about. These stories, the ones who walk away from Omelas and the ones who stay and fight, are incredibly important stories that make us think. And how we interpret them, how we react to them, whether we agree with them, whether we argue with them, whether we disagree or vehemently dislike what is in them, finding out why we react that way. What is it that we are reacting against? Taking a step back from that, paring it down. What am I reacting against? Why do I dislike this? Going to root cause. People in business will talk about root cause analysis, but digging down through it. And then asking yourself, if I change the positions to ones I am in line with, that I agree with, and I flip the narrative, do I now suddenly agree with it? So it's not so much the process that I'm disagreeing with, it's the politics, the ideology, or the concept that the author is putting forward? Or do I still disagree with it? Because it's not so much about the context of the content, because I agree with the author's approach to that. What I'm disagreeing with is the method. Asking those questions reveals aspects of our own beliefs, our own ideology, our own approach. It can reveal aspects of our own bias, that we don't see problems with these things because we so readily agree with them. And then we can't understand why other people disagree with them. And you go, but it's so obvious. And the thing is, if something is appearing as very, very obvious, it's quite often because it blends with what we think and we believe. And if the other people don't think and believe the same thing as us, then they're not going to see it. So how do we explain it? How do we communicate when people cannot see the same things? And it's trying to do analysis like this, to think through things, to see things from a different perspective, from a different set of shoes, from a different political background, from a different ideology, from a different way of growing up. That when we do that, when we practice doing that, it suddenly makes it easier to understand arguments from the other side of a debate that we disagree with. And when we understand those arguments, when we understand where people are coming from, it can help us find a way to communicate, either to frame things in a language that the other side will understand, to reassure them about what they fear is not the thing that we are talking about, to make analogies so that they can understand our position and see that it is actually very similar to theirs, but we're disagreeing on minor aspects. All of this that we find in literature, that we practice in literature because it is safe. It is not world-ending, real-world politics and ideologies and fights. That looking at these stories allows us to think through these things in a way to refine our understanding, so that when we are confronted with very complex, difficult, emotive subjects in the real world tragedies, real world politics, when we get into those scenarios and passions are high because people strongly believe in X, we can apply the techniques that we learn from this to the real world. And hopefully, the more of us that are aware of this, the more of us that practice these sorts of techniques, these sorts of different ways of understanding things from different perspectives, being able to move from the surface right through the subtext to the abstract, to the conceptual, and back. That when we practice that with literature in a way that is not impacting our real lives, we can then apply it to the real world. We can communicate with people on the other side, and we don't resort to superficial or simplistic or knee-jerk reactions. That we try to achieve genuine understanding instead of assuming moral superiority or I am right and you are wrong. Because if we distill things down into a binary all the time of I am right and you are wrong, we must then enforce our rightness on them. And that is a structural form of violence. I'm going to enforce my view as the right view, and you're wrong. Therefore, you will do what I say, and I will impose that on you. And that creates resentment. We haven't convinced the other person that we are right. We've just told them that they are wrong. We haven't gotten them to change their mind. We have just punished them for not agreeing with us. And I think that literature, works by brilliant authors like N.K.Jemisin and Ursula K, These works are the keystone for enacting great change in our world, not because they're imposing a moral view on the world, but they are actually giving us the tools to work together to create a world that is better for everyone. But these were just my thoughts on these two. I think they're great stories. I think everyone should read them. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.